that's the thing with the migration issue. All of our countries in the developed world are struggling with this. I think broadly speaking, a lot of our politicians treat us like we are incredibly febrile, easily riled up, dangerous mobs.
Douglas thinks that we shouldn't let the Palestinians stay in London.
My own view is that it shouldn't, and it shouldn't because it's not because it should be banned, but because it's a grotesque insult to the British people. It's a deliberately provocative day to choose for such a march. It's a deliberately provocative march.
The Telegraph also showed that around half of the organisers of the march are linked with bad organisations.
As the Telegraph showed just yesterday, around half of the organisers of the march are themselves linked with, which isn't at all surprising. We have commanders, after all, who live in London very safely, often on welfare.
Douglas states that it's intolerable provocation to the British public and government.
So, yes, I think it's an intolerable march. It's an intolerable provocation to the British public and the British government and the British police, by the way, who Saturday after Saturday have been made to put up with unbelievable taunting and abuse from the marchers.
And the crowds are pushing the police further and more provocative.
It's very clear by now, Piers, that what is happening is that every week the crowds are pushing and seeing if they can push the police further and further, harder and harder, and be more and more provocative. And they're managing to do that.
Douglas thinks that large numbers of the British public are just not going to put up with this.
But this is culminating this weekend, and here's the thing. I don't think, and I certainly read and hear, that large numbers of the British public are just not going to put up with this. Well, we'll try to single those two things out for a second. First of all, I don't regard Nicholas Soames as a sort of hereditary inheritor of the mantle of Churchill just because he happens to be his grandson.
He believes the UK is in a deep, unsolvable crisis.
Besides what you quoted from Christopher earlier, he would never have said that right extended to supporting terror groups. I mean, we're in a total quandary in the UK, as you know, and it's a despicable quandary to be in. We host leaders. We have a former deputy prime minister of Iran living in Harrow. We've been at the centre of allowing these people to be in our country and indeed to plot terror from our country for years. So it's always a bit rich to hear the British, I think, lecturing others about being an unsound part of the international security community. As for the actual marches, look, I'm afraid that the rules on this are very, very clear. You are not allowed to glorify terror or call for terror on the streets of Britain. And that existed before the 2006 Act banned glorification, and it certainly exists now. I'll tell you what's unique about the population of Gaza. It's the only population in the world where people routinely claim are committing genocide, but which has a population boom all of the time. I mean, that strikes me as being quite an interesting thing about the Gaza. But as for the moral community, I want to make a very, very important point, if I can say so, on this, which is, people quite often abuse history, and they say things all the time. I mean, about the only thing anyone from history knows is about. Here's something I can tell you with absolute certainty, Piers, having not just seen some of the results of what did on the ground here in a few weeks ago, but having watched the videos of the unedited footage, which I was one of the journalists was sadly allowed to see the other day, I can tell you one thing: the comparison between and the is insufficient. And sorry, there's an incoming. It's fine. Sorry, it was a rocket coming. Looked like it was just going to land on us here.
In Sweden, those who break immigration rules face strict penalties.
As you say, this is in 2015, the Swedes opened their borders. They said it's incredibly important to be open-hearted and generous to the world and so on. But what they did was, as we just heard in the previous segment, they did what a lot of governments have been doing. You effectively punish people who come to our countries legally. You punish them and you incentivize people who break the rules and come illegally. And that's happening everywhere from Sweden to America to Britain and Australia. It's an astonishing mistake. But yes, I mean, as Rita says, you have this this crazy situation. Like Sweden, do you remember the old days? We all used to talk about Sweden, always a Scandinavian option for everything. Anything in life could be improved by referring to Scandinavia. People would say, oh, well, the Swedish this, the Danish that, whether it was a hot drink or a way to feel good or a policy. It was always about Scandinavia. And then, as you say, Rita, you get this situation where you have now Sweden, the second largest number of any country not officially only after Mexico. Only after Mexico. And if I'd have said to you 10 years ago, what do you think about when you think about Sweden? Like me, you'd have probably said, well, I don't know, hot drinks, overpriced food, but nice people, or rather cold. You wouldn't have said, oh, the traditional Swedish. Never forget the intrinsic importance to our culture of grenades, but that's the case because they just didn't care about who they let in, and it meant that they were letting in military-aged males who very often lied about their age. And, none of this, there are legitimate asylum seekers in the world. Those people are completely stripped of their capabilities and their rights. When you allow, as I've seen this in Sweden myself, big bearded guys in their 20s who say, oh, I'm a child migrant, allowed into a school and so on, and they just lose control of everything. But, that's the thing with the migration issue. All of our countries in the developed world are struggling with this.
Millions worldwide are desperate to migrate to safer nations.
There are millions upon millions of people in the world who want to come to relatively safe, liberal, democratic countries like this one, like Britain, like America, like European countries. And the question is, are we able to step up to that challenge and actually bring in people at a reasonable rate, or is that too difficult for our politicians? Well, that's right. I mean, we know, James, don't we? We know the values of this. We know the reason why people come to our countries. There is no movement the other way. I mean, I always say, when the boats were coming to Australia with illegals from other parts of this region, it wasn't like they met boats the other way of Aussies desperately trying to flee the oppressive, conservative or otherwise government in Australia. The movement is always one way. I mean, you don't even get people moving from Britain to France on the boats. It's always France to Britain. People want to move up through Europe. When people cross the Rio Grande, when these Mexican cartels and others take very, very beleaguered people who've given their life savings to horrible, horrible gangs, you don't find a bunch of Texans saying they want to flee to the freedom of Ecuador. Now, my point on that is, therefore, we should have the courage to say, look, at the very least, we must be doing something right. There must be something we're doing right.
Despite years of awareness, immigration and integration remain unresolved issues.
It's a very strange thing, and as you said it before, we've got this situation where you can talk about it in economic terms, you can talk about it in housing terms, but the larger cultural terms are still a third rail. And I'm astonished that after all of these years, we've known the issues of immigration and integration for many years. I'm amazed that we're still in all of our countries at this very, very toddler stage of the debate. It shouldn't be that hard to say, look, if you want to come to Australia, you want to become part of Australia, you've got something to give to this country, and you will give to this country, and you want to be part of it, fantastic. Join the queue and let's see what we can do. But if it's the case that you want to come here and you don't really like the place, or you want to change the place, or you want to change the place back to the sort of place where the place you left from, and maybe it's some of the reasons why you left, then maybe that's not going to be a workable deal. Yes, I mean, effectively a mob outside of Parliament affected the workings of Parliament in Westminster. But, the really interesting thing on that is the politicians, even after that happened, couldn't identify who had been doing the threatening. They couldn't identify it. They talk about it, all of our politicians do that. They talk about these amorphous things like, we must stand against hate. Okay, and then what? And who? Get specific. Who were the group outside Parliament? Who was it projecting slogans onto Big Ben and our representatives are meant to be voting? Who is it that our representatives feel a threat from? And this can go wrong really fast if you don't identify it. I mean, our politicians should be frank. Are they feeling terrible threats and changes to their voting processes because of people from Wales? Or is it like people who is it the people who live and work in Chinatown? Is that a place that members of Parliament shouldn't go? Let's be specific about it. And they cannot be, and even in Britain, and Rita and I have spoken about this before, even in Britain, when another of our MPs was a couple of years ago, even then, his colleagues couldn't identify the ideology that had their colleague. They talked about him as if he died of natural causes. And I think they do a great dishonour, not just to their colleague and to themselves, but to the public when they can't be open and honest about that. I think broadly speaking, a lot of our politicians treat us like we are incredibly febrile, easily riled up, dangerous mobs. Decent sort of person. Same thing with the British public. Same thing with the American public. We're not deplorables. We're not easily riled, violent gangs.
So, history of Christianity.
Tom, do you remember when the atheist movement had hit this atheist plus movement? Do you remember atheism plus?
What was that?
Joe Rogan talks about the rise of the atheist plus movement. This movement promotes being anti-discrimination and anti-racist as new forms of belief.
It was weird, and it was a bunch of these weird virtue-signaling male feminist types that were adding, with atheism, adding a group of core values.
Oh, wow.
About, being anti-racist.
Their own 10 Commandments.
Yes. And so they called it atheism plus. And I remember watching this guy give this speech, this boring speech on this sort of establishing this idea that because you don't have a religion, so we're going to be atheists, but with plus, we can establish sort of a moral framework.
Well, it's totally understandable and a disaster, of course. Even
if the ideas are good, it's like you're putting it in an ideology.
Those people still exist. There's a guy who's still selling his silver water that he blesses from the River Jordan or something. It comes out some hose in his garden in Texas. Yeah. And there are people who've been busted repeatedly, and they're still selling their wares. I always thought, if somebody actually made the prophet claim in our era, I think people would be surprised how many people would go along with it. It's the late George Steiner described a phrase I love: nostalgia for the absolute. I love that phrase, a nostalgia for the absolute. I think a lot of people have it. I have it. We all have it to some extent. And the question is whether you can avoid it taking you to places that would demoralize you and lead you to a bad place.
He questions the assertion that our basic shared ethics are self-evident.
It's not a secret, that having been said, I was born and brought up a Christian, as a believing Christian, from I think most of my life, including through my adult life. And I'm now in, I suppose, a self-confessedly conflicted, complex situation of being, among other things, an uncomfortable agnostic who recognizes the values and the virtues that the Christian faith has brought. I think I sort of laid out how I think our civilization, our culture has got to the stage that it is at the moment and its current uncomfortable relationship with faith. I tried to lay that out in the strange of Europe. I still believe what I wrote there was accurate as a diagnosis of the era. But it's and it's a very uncomfortable, as I say, position that someone like me is in, because I say, there has been a period of rejection of faith, particularly from what in our lifetimes has been known as the New Atheist movement, which made claims that were self-confessedly wrong. That, for instance, actually I think as a late friend of both Tom Wright's and mine, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once said, that the claim that for instance, morality was obvious, was obviously wrong. The claim that basic ethics that we might share are self-evident is self-evidently not the case. One doesn't have to be an ethicist to know that. You just need to travel. You need to read, look and listen, and to know that's the case. So there has, in my view, I think we spoke about this before, Justin, but there has, in my view, been an interesting movement in recent years, which I think Tom Holland, who you mentioned earlier, is certainly an example of people saying, actually, if we go back and look at this, what we have and what we like does have roots in this, in the Christian story. Now, the follow-on question from there, I suppose, is, well, what do we do about it? And I think that a great failing of our time has been the tendency to talk past each other on this. The religious tend to say, well, it's easy, you just have to believe. If you recognize these virtues and values, then believe, and doesn't take into account the fact that very many people today, it is harder than that, for all sorts of reasons we could go into. But I would just make one other observation, which is that even outside of faith, I have an added discomfort, which is the discomfort of a non-believer who is disappointed by the behavior of the believing church. Now, many people think that's paradoxical, but it isn't at all.
Based on his experience, Douglas observes many churches evolving into something else.
Not only was brought up in, but afterwards sought the church as it has been in England, and its jewels and gems of the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and much more. And it's been my experience, as it has been for many other people brought up in recent decades and last century and more, that one has observed the church giving up its jewels and becoming something else. And actually, that irritation I feel from the outside, albeit from the outside at the moment, that irritation I feel about the church hasn't gone away even whilst being outside it. A fear, it comes back to that article that provoked Tom Wright's excellent letter. My fear is constantly the church is not doing what so many of us on the outside would like it to do, which is to be preaching its gospel, to be asserting its truths and its claims. And so when one sees it falling into all of the latest tropes, one just thinks, well, that's another thing gone. It's just like absolutely everything else in the era. Everything in this boring, monotone, ill thought out and shallow dialectic. And so as I say, I'm a disappointed non-adherent. You can't wish things you know and wish them unknown, or wish them unlearned. And this is something I think is very important in all dialogue between believers and non-believers. I just wanted to say, I wouldn't like it to be anyone to take away from this that I simply think that the church has a PR problem. It isn't just that I think that the presentation is wrong, or that there's a mistake in, for instance, falling into the religion of anti-racism or anything else. It's that I do believe that doing that means that the church fails to tell its own story. We had an article in the Spectator, I think last week, from my friend.
He believes it's not just a PR misunderstanding, but a missed opportunity within the church.
He made a very powerful point about the figures in the church, for instance, who were profoundly anti, and not just Wilberforce, but Charlemagne and others who saints in the 7th century, Christian saints in the 7th century, who were martyred and objected to the in their own time. There is, what I'm trying to say is that it's not just that there is a PR misunderstanding, it seems to me, within the church, and it's missing a trick. It is that this is not a fair summary of the Christian story. It isn't a fair summary of the story of the church. And what it is the adoption of a facile and profoundly hostile analysis of the church, which sees the church, for instance, as being a white enterprise. But it clearly isn't. Like Tom Wright seen congregations across the world. I've been at services throughout the Middle East, across Africa. Beleaguered communities sometimes show absolutely extraordinary and inspiring levels of faith. And I don't recognize the negative interpretation of the church, which I see from some people trying to force a different ethic on the church today. But as I say, it's not just in the history of the church, but in the story that the church has to tell about itself today, that I think that there is an error being made. Because, for instance, to go back to something which, as Tom Wright knows, I wrote about in The Madness of Crowds, if you look at the great error of the ideology which is trying to embed today, it is that it has spent no time bothering itself over the question of forgiveness. Now, it's not just that I think that the church is missing a PR trick in not addressing this. I think that the church does everybody in society the most enormous disservice if it doesn't say, this is what our faith is built upon. We have been thinking about this and trying to practice it, at least, for millennia. So at least give us your ear for a moment.
Douglas shares his perspective on Christians and his beliefs.
Well, it means I'm not a believer in God, or at least I find it very hard to believe in God. I'd say maybe agnostic is better. But obviously I'm a Christian because I was born in a Christian civilization, a Christian country, and brought up a Christian. So, I mean, there are people who lose their faith or don't have faith and are Jewish or Muslim, but that's not the same thing as a Christian atheist. I just think it's absurd not to concede the fact that much of what we have in America, like Britain, Canada, is derived from Christian ethics,
right?
Christian ideas. And why deny that? I mean, you might not believe it, but you shouldn't deny it because it's obvious. I mean, what are human rights but a kind of derivation of a form of spilt Christianity? There's no reason to have human rights. They're not self-evident.
No.
So I think that, you should just concede these things where they're true, and even if they're against your interests. And obviously, the atheist is against their interests very often, but nevertheless. And I also say that it's important to concede this because you should try to work out, I think, whether you want to engage in sawing off a branch of a tree that you're sitting on.
He speculates how Christianity's history might have been different if Jesus were more like Muhammad.
What is one of the greatest moments in Christian scripture, but the moment when Jesus has brought to him the woman who is caught in adultery. And what does Jesus say when the crowd wanted to stone her for her sins? He says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." And the crowd go away. Now, in the Islamic tradition, a very, very similar thing happens when a woman is brought to Muhammad and he has her stoned. So, history of Christianity, more bloody or less bloody if Jesus was more like Muhammad?
Douglas underscores the belief that all men are equal because they are created equal by God.
I think everyone would say likely to be more bloody. There are enlightened traditions within certain Muslim traditions, certain ones. They tend, by the way, to be highly prejudiced against by other Muslims. I'm thinking of things like the Ahmadiyya community, certain branches of Sufi Islam, which have very admirable attitudes towards enlightenment and a sort of syncretic belief of their own. But these are minority sects within Islam and are largely hated by other Muslims. Islam is about subjugation to Allah. And that's why one of the reasons why the Muslim world is as it is. The Christian world is as it is because of the legacy of Christianity. I mean, it's from Christianity that we get the idea of rights. Why do I say that? Because even the framers of the European Constitution pretty much knew this. Certainly the framers of the UN Declaration on Human Rights knew this. Certainly the founding fathers of the United States knew this. That the reason why all men are regarded as equal is because all of mankind is created equal by God. And that people may be different in their lives, and we're all different in our lives, and you may be a car mechanic or a king, but that we're all the same. all the same in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the Creator. Nobody to that extent has the ability to be, is by nature better or worse than anyone else. It's the adventure of their lives to try to be better. But all of these ideas, like the dignity of the individual, these come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And without them, we would be, like China, or like the Islamic world, or like anywhere else. If we had a different tradition in our past, we would be in a different place now. But this was our tradition. This is our tradition. And anyone who thinks that what I've just described is as water is to fish is making a vast category error. This idea that Western civilization is like a cut flower and you can look at it and enjoy it, but it's going to... So how do we make sure that it isn't a cut flower? And the answer to that is, of course, we find the seeds that planted the flowers and we reseed the land. We replant the flowers, the trees and the bushes of our culture and of our civilization. And that's what we should do. That will be part of the task ahead. And that doesn't mean the dogmatic re-Christianization, although some people might like to go that route, but it does mean a recognition of the well springs. And, without that, nothing good can come. Without that, we will simply be a flower that withers.
He discusses the potential overlap between the realms of science and religion.
It is a sort of a necessary thing to begin with, which is the issue of the magisteria. We are talking about them separately, but of course the interrelation of them. Whether or not the realms of science and religion are overlapping magisteria or not. And of course, some people would claim that they're absolutely unrelated. We're getting towards, I think, in this discussion, the realization that of course they're overlapping to some degree. We don't know exactly how much. Jonathan probably thinks very significantly. I suspect Jordan thinks to some extent, and I would say to some extent as well. But let me throw out then two issues that I would put as a challenge both for the religious and the non-religious in the discussion that we're heading towards. The first is a challenge for the non-religious, and that's to do with something that Jordan's already talked about, which is the area of ethics and shared values and much more. A great challenge for the non-believers in our age is that issue of where the values come from. And as Jordan's already suggested, for instance, the Enlightenment, the idea of rationalism, soul rationalism, which not all Enlightenment thinkers were dealing with, but many were. The idea of rationalism being the sole way in which to discern ethics seems to me not to have been embedded very wide or very deep, and may suggest that it's just not possible as a project. So, to quote my late friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs on this, the idea that ethics are self-evident is self-evidently wrong.
The challenge for believers, he says, is in treating myths or stories as if they hold ultimate truth.
So let me throw that out first as a challenge for the non-believer. Then the challenge for the believer comes down to this thing that Jordan's also already dealt in, which is the issue of, let's say, myth or story. Because we might agree, for instance, that we need a story to agree upon, or a myth to agree upon, or a set of ideas to rely upon and to ground ourselves in. And that doesn't necessarily, of course, by any means lead to the fact that those things are also true. We get into the realm of what Schopenhauer in the dialogue on religion, which always made a huge impression on me, deals in, where he says, of course, what he describes as the tragedy of the clergy. That the tragedy of the clergy is that they know the necessity of the thing, they know the truthfulness of the story, in a certain sense of truthfulness, but could never admit, or their job would be over, that that's what it is.
They must navigate their faith as if these stories are not just allegorical, but have real truth claims.
In other words, they have to continue to deal in it as if this is not simply story or unifying myth or anything like that, but is something which has a truth claim behind it. And then let me just say one other thing on that, which is this. the issue of unifying ethic, because it must be what we're sort of somehow also, among other things, as well as trying to define what the true is and what the real is, must be one of the things that we must sort of try to grapple towards. The issue on this seems to me to be, is the Christian ethic, the Christian tradition, to think of it in Hegelian terms, is it an exhausted force or an unexhausted force? This for our age seems to me to be one of the absolutely crucial issues to address. Is it exhausted or unexhausted? I mean, the issue with the Bible, the issue with Christianity, the issue with faith is that it's obviously different. It must be in a different realm. It's clearly in a different realm because it claims different things for itself. Dostoevsky doesn't demand that we believe that Raskolnikov lived.